Because of that essay I found from Josephine Pasternak, I wrote a musical about the White Rose, and I realized that I never would have found any of that if it weren't for you and for the classes that I took with you, and I never would have been in the archives at all. This is Jennifer Rosenfeld, and you're listening to part 3 of the White Rose podcast. Here's the great irony about this project. I never would have written a musical about the White Rose if I hadn't been a Russian literature major. Not only was that the subject matter that led me to the Hoover Archives, where I discovered Josephine's document, but it was also through studying the works of Boris Pasternak and other literary, musical, and artistic figures in 20th century Russia that gave me the intellectual and artistic outlook that would shape how I came to understand the White Rose when I returned to that subject matter later. I really have to credit my deep interest in Russia in large part to my professor and senior honors thesis advisor, Lazar Fleischman.
I am really very grateful to you for stirring the memories about our conversations about this subject. And it is really a fascinating episode in, I would say, the Pasternak family's life. And perhaps for those who are interested in German intellectual history of the pre-war and war period, this is a somewhat alien theme for me, but it made it even more intriguing for me to somewhat plunge into this material.
And here's something else that's so fascinating to me and is really more of a recent discovery, which is the role that Russia and contact with Russia and Russian people played for the members of the White Rose and in the actions they chose to make. Alexander Shmorel, one of the members of the group, was Russian, and his role in the group, as emphasized by Josephine, is something that I think is sort of underappreciated in our English-speaking understanding of the material. And the events of 1942, when the members of the White Rose went to Russia, the Battle of Stalingrad, all of these had tremendous consequences for the choices that the members of this group made at the beginning of 1943. So I was so excited to speak with my professor. I knew he could offer some insight into helping us understand it through his knowledge of Josephine, the Pasternak family, and the time period. I read Josephine's memoir, Tightrope Walking. It recounts her life during, her teenage years, early 20s. One convenient thing about Josephine Pasternak is that she was born in the year 1900, so it makes it really easy to track what age she was at the different stages of this story, different moments over the course of the 20th century. It was interesting to hear more about her. It sounds like in the family, there were these great artistic luminaries. It sounds to me like perhaps she had some potential, but that was not able to be expressed due to her own anxieties, but also the constant moving around and just the nature of the times. But it was interesting to sort of see a portrait of her at those ages too.
She wrote poetry herself, published 2 books of poetry, and her younger sister also was a poet, also wrote poetry, translated her brother's poetry into English. You can imagine how intense was spiritual life in this family. Of course, much of this intensity was under direct impact of their parents. And indeed, the children from early childhood were present at the meetings, at the encounters, at the intellectual exchange of whom we now consider to be one of the most prominent figures in Russian cultural time of the so-called Silver Age, pre-revolutionary and post-revolutionary.
He's talking about Leonid Pasternak, who was Josephine's father. He was one of the great painters in Russia. As it turns out, Professor Fleischman had actually met Josephine just a few years before her death.
I met with her once and had quite a long conversation. Yes, it was in 1990. She was still beautiful, a beautiful lady. with a lot of charm. She led the conversation also very intense in the discussion of a large variety of subjects. Now, what I would like to say, she departed from Moscow, from Soviet Russia, at the age of 21, and everyone in the family was fearful for her because of her assumed inability to adjust herself to the external world. Something of this sort you probably detected from her recollections. It bordered on the boundary between sanity and insanity at some age and some periods, especially after the death of her father in 1945. It was during that period that she wrote her comments about the White Rose. So she departed
from Russia and initially moved to Berlin.
in 1921, in the same year when the Schmorals left Soviet Russia. And it can be imagined that they could meet at the German embassy prior to their departure. This was the beginning of the diplomatic relations between the new state, the Soviet Union.
And my understanding is that she went to Germany to go to school because as a bourgeois person, is that true or?
That's one of the explanations that we should not take at face value.
Okay. In the Soviet Union in the 1920s, the educated, artistic, intellectual families were suddenly enemies of the people under the new communist regime. And as a result, for Josephine, who was in her early 20s, she was apparently unable to go to university in the Soviet Union. So that was what prompted her move to Germany. At least that was the explanation that she provided in her memoir, Tightrope Walking. But Professor Fleischman suggests that there might be more to the story.
She never wanted to attach any kind of the hint at political interpretation of the changes in her life and in the life of her parents and siblings.
Why is that?
First of all, because of the deep apolitical stance that pervaded in their family, in the entire family. But second, because her brothers remained in the Soviet Union. And there was a third reason as well. She always was longing of returning to Russia in the belief that she will encounter in the Soviet Union, even under Stalin, the kind of life they enjoyed so much prior to the revolution. Of course, this is a utopian, a crazy idea, and thank God she never, realized it. I think that it was only when Josephine moved to Munich in 1924, moved to Munich with her newlywed husband, her second cousin, Fyodor, who occupied a very prominent position at the Mendelssohn Bank. And the Mendelssohn Bank arguably was the richest bank in Weimar Germany that was confiscated by the Nazis in 1938 when they were able to move for England in 1938. Okay, that's a background.
We're discussing how it came to be that Josephine and the Pasternak family got to know the Schmorell family.
So in 1924, but I am not sure that they met frequently with this family before Leonid and Rosalia,
Josephine's parents,
started visiting them in Munich, usually for summer holidays. I can imagine how it happened because, they were looking, first of all, of course, for a physician.
Alexander's father, Hugo, became the family doctor of the Pasternaks in Munich.
And second, for a Russian-speaking family. And I think that's how developed such close relations between two families, whereas I don't think that the contact between Josephine and Alexander or Shurik.
Shurik was Alexander's Russian nickname.
Played such a significant role if you imagine how large was the difference in age.
He wanted to be a sculptor, so I wonder if
Yeah,
he took any influence from Leonid.
of course, they admired visual art and painting, and of course, respected very much Leonid Pasternak, who was able to win a very prominent reputation in Germany during the late 20th and early 30s. In Germany, Leonid Pasternak and Rosalia Isidorovna, they were surrounded by people of approximately similar standing and intellectual elite as it used to be in Russia earlier, dominated, by the way, by Jews in Weimar, Germany.
The Pasternak family was Jewish as well, which was part of the reason that they had to flee Germany in 1938 for England. And their relationship with being Jewish is a whole other interesting story.
And so, from the point of view of this family, of the family of the Schmorls, acquaintance with such people was, of course, a very valuable aspect of life.
So what he's saying, and this is significant for White Rose purposes, is that Alexander grew up in a home that was not only cosmopolitan in his experiences of artistic people and the Russian emigres, but also it was common for there to be Jews in his home growing up, and this also shaped his worldview.
Of course, they were very much welcome.
Right.
Welcome in the Schmorls family, especially because of its distinctly Russian character.
Yeah. Well, it was interesting to me because so much of the literature about the White Rose that's available in English is about Hans and Sophie Scholl, but it seems like Alexander played a very, very important role in the formation of those ideas. But also, I know they had a family friend who he traveled in Eastern Europe, and he was the one who saw the death camps and all of that and conveyed that information to the Schmorl family. And then when Alexander and Hans and the other students went to the Eastern Front in the fall of 1942, it was Alexander who was the translator, and they all sort of became enamored with Russia, and that was a big part of their motivation to do what they did at the end. So I think he's sort of underrepresented in our English understanding of what happened. So it's interesting.
It's a very interesting point in Josephine's article written in 1953, where she complains that it is too near and too far at the same time to the moment of her writing down.
It is at once too near and too far from our own time. Too near because only in historical perspective will an adequate consideration be possible. Too far because, though highly topical at the time of its happening, after 10 years, the Munich incident has fallen into oblivion and is hardly known, not only by the general public, but even by students of the Hitler era in Germany.
And she explains why it is too near, because, there are no sufficiently rich literature, and including memoir literature about them. And we can imagine, in 1953, West Germany was just 4 years old. It was a new state. And of course, we must imagine all instability of political, historical situation of this time in order to better, grasp the complexity of the issues that she was struggling writing this. What precisely prompted her to write this article? Perhaps simply the 10th anniversary and the scarcity of reminiscences or writings about them, at least scarcity of the writings that would satisfy her.
The best clue I can find as far as Josephine's motivation for writing this essay is found in the letter she wrote to Professor John Neff, who had written an article that inspired her to draw parallels between The White Rose and a philosophical point he was trying to make about the role the mind has played in human history. In this letter she wrote to John Neff, she shares a bit more about her background with the members of The White Rose, in particular Kurt Huber.
Living in Oxford, so close to a source of spirituality, I have a feeling of responsibility. The more so because in 1930, I took my philosophical degree working under Professor Huber's supervision at the Munich Institute of Experimental Psychology. I promised Huber's sister to do something about the case in general. This promise weighs on my conscience.
And it's not only her personal connection to Huber that gives Josephine a feeling of responsibility, it's the fact that she knows from personal experience that any attempts she makes to get someone else to take interest will basically be in vain.
Having had Huber's book returned to me, I was about to talk to one or the other Oxford historian or philosopher whom I happen to know. Alas, I know the answers in advance. They will show understanding, sympathy, readiness. Yet, either the whole thing will be outside their sphere, or at the best, they will ask the book to be sent to them. A year will pass. They will not have glimpsed at it. And, being an unimportant person outside the rarefied atmosphere of Oxford University, how could I remind them, bothering them, to read, to write, to become concerned?
Now, a question that I had for Professor Fleischman, which actually was not related to The White Rose, but I just felt like I had to ask, was in regards to the last encounter that Josephine had ever with her brother Boris. It was in 1935, and it was, I believe, at a train station in Berlin when he was on his way to present at a writers' conference in Paris. He didn't want to go, but he was sent to represent the Soviet Writers' Union and to sort of show off on behalf of his country, something he really did not want to do. And I just thought there was something tragic about their last encounter being so brief. So I asked Professor Fleischman about it, and it actually took us in an interesting direction.
Boris was on his way to Paris to participate in the anti-fascist Congress of Writers there. It was a very short stay. And she traveled to Berlin in order to spend with him a few minutes that were at their disposal, because it was clear that, he will not be able to stop for a longer time and had to avoid a longer stay because of his participation in the anti-fascist meeting.
Which he didn't want to participate in at all, from what I recall.
He didn't want to go there also, because first of his apolitical stance, and because he understood that he became just an instrument of propaganda, of Stalinist propaganda in this confrontation with Nazi regime.
The tragic reality of those times is that Josephine and the rest of her family in Germany really had no idea what her brother, was experiencing throughout the 30s and this chapter of his life, in part because the lack of proximity and contact, but also, again, because all the mail was censored. And just as in Nazi Germany, as it would become the case later on, there was such a tight hold on people's communications. That was already the case in Soviet Russia in the 20s and the 30s. Boris Pasternak, he was declared the premier Soviet poet in the 1930s. And this position created a bunch of challenges for him, in part because his signature poetic style was really based on playing with the ambiguity of language. And this was diametrically opposed to the one permitted style in the Soviet era, which was Soviet realism. So essentially, not long after he received this very prominent title and accolade, he basically stopped creating original works and would only do translations because he felt that it was safer. And 2 decades later, when Dr. Zhivago was published abroad in 1957, it became the subject of an enormous scandal. Pasternak got into terrible trouble with his own country because he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Literature for Dr. Zhivago. The novel was perceived as a critique of the Soviet era of communism. And even though there are those elements in the book, there's so much more, but it wasn't available in Russian or in the Soviet Union until the 80s. So Pasternak declined the Nobel Prize. He was told that if he were to leave to accept the award in Sweden, he would never be allowed back into the Soviet Union. So he declined the award. He was publicly shamed and humiliated. He was kicked out of the Writers' Union. All the other Soviet writers were forced to sign a letter denouncing him, and he died a few years later. So again, even though this happened after Josephine wrote her essay, the seeds of suffering terrible consequences for one's creative expression were already planted within the Pasternak family. In fact, Josephine wrote in her memoir in the 60s that Boris burned himself for the sake of his art.
In order to better understand how important for Josephine was the case of Shurik's moral and what is hidden behind her portrait of him, is that from the point of view of Boris Pasternak, that he expressed in his letter to his parents in 1933, if I don't mistake, it was already in April or in May of 1933 that he spoke of the Nazi and Soviet regime as two twins, as two wings of the same phenomenon. Equated. That's a somewhat heretical idea from the point of view of any Soviet citizen in 1933, and that's something that is officially banned to pronounce even today in Russia under Putin. Such comparison is outlawed.
And can you say more about what did he mean by that? What was he saying was so similar?
Look, just on the basis of the short period of 3 or 4 months after Hitler's rise to power, he already discerned what we later came to call totalitarianism. Yes, totalitarian regime. And the essence of both regimes is the rejection of Christianity, of Christian norms and ideas.
And so that's the rejection of God, but it's also the rejection of individuality as an extension.
Yes. This call is...
In both Soviet Russia and Nazi Germany, a foundational pillar behind the ideology was this notion that extraordinary measures were justified in pursuit of this collective good. And that sounds great if you're part of the group of people for whom the collective good is enactive, but it's not so great when you're not. And part of what was really interesting in Soviet Russia was just how quickly that definition could change. Particularly, we saw this in the 1930s. 36 to 38 was the period known as the Great Purge. Even people who had been high-ranking members of the Soviet Party one day, the next were found to be enemies of the state. Many of these individuals were convicted in show trials, which became quite popular in the Soviet Union in the late 30s, and also served as a model for the trials that political dissidents would face in Nazi Germany, including the members of the White Rose. A show trial is basically when the judiciary has determined the outcome already, but the court proceedings are there to send a message and to set an example for what happens to traitors. So in the Soviet Union, the defendants were basically forced to go along with it. They were forced to confess to crimes they didn't commit and participate in this political theater in order to send a message. And still the outcome would be being sent to the gulag or execution anyways. Back to the similarities between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia. The interrogation transcripts of Kurt Huber, he talked about this too, where he was sort of a very conservative German who it sounds like initially was sort of in favor of a more nationalistic stance, but he participated and wrote that leaflet because he accused Hitler of making the country more socialist, in fact, in terms of its suppression of individual rights, and sort of the needless slaughter of young Germans. So it seems like he was in many ways drawing that parallel, whereas I know that Alexander was not, he wrote that he was not any fan of Bolshevism or communism, but there were others around the White Rose who were more left-leaning. But it's just interesting, so many things, but to me it looks like these cultures were actually very similar in how they treated their societies.
Mm-hmm. No, as everywhere, the nuances are of utmost importance.
Mm.
I don't know to what extent, I paid attention to his testimonies during the interrogation that he was not pro-Bolshevik and rather monarchist leaning person. Probably it was part of his interpretation of himself as a Russian, as being Russian along with being German.
Right.
Because, it's such split of identity, maybe quite a painful state, and one must find additional support for every element of here. And I think that this can be, first of all, it could be prompted by his contacts with Russians in Munich. Russians in Munich were much, much more right-wing, monarchist, Tsarist thinking persons than the rest of Russian emigration in Germany, in Berlin, for example. Munich was a kind of the capital of right-wing Russia in Germany in the 20s, in the early 20s. In the 30s, in generally speaking, the Russian community there was very small. And Russian Orthodox congregation was also small. So it means that any contact, even chance contact, could become more important for such person as Shurik Shmorel, who tried to become perhaps more authentic in terms of Russianness than, for example, his siblings. And the second factor that could also have some impact on him in this regard is his encounter with authentic Russia when he went to this Gzhatsk area.
This is when Alexander, Hans, and Willy were sent to the Eastern Front to be medics, going alongside the German army in the summer and fall of 1942.
And he attended Russian Orthodox church services in the country, in the place where Orthodox churches were closed one after another in the 30s. It was Hitler who reopened these churches.
Why?
Yes, it is a known fact. Wow. And then Stalin followed his suit and reopened the Russian Orthodox churches after the long period of closure and brought back the Orthodox priests from the prisons to serve. Yes, but this is such religious revival in Russia coincided with the intrusion of German troops, of Nazi troops there.
Do you think, why did Stalin do that? Do you think it was to increase morale for the war?
Because Bolshevism was not compatible with Christianity. That's understandable, Bolshevism. As by the way, it was not compatible with Nazism, but and we know that Catholic resistance to Hitler was quite a strong phenomenon, quite a perceptible phenomenon. In this sense, Hitler, I would say, was more cautious than Stalin and the Bolsheviks during the 20s and early 30s. It is clear that Hitler learned a lot from Russian Bolsheviks during his formative years.
Right. Well, and also, the judge for the trials of the White Rose and so many of the political dissidents in the 40s, he went to the Vyshinsky trials in the 1930s in Russia and, got some inspiration.
And learned how to conduct the trials.
Learning from each other's influence
we're talented students, pupils.
If you go on YouTube, you can actually see video of the judge, Roland Freisler, who presided over the White Rose trials. He's the one I was mentioning who had basically learned his skill from Andrei Vyshinsky, who was the prosecutor under Stalin. And here's some of what Roland Freisler sounds like. I remember watching these videos in Professor Bernhardt's class when I was a freshman in college and being just kind of stunned by how chilling they are.
Ihnen werden wir fertig. Leute! Sie sind ja ein Imperium!
One of the most amazing things that happened to me over the course of working on this project was receiving access to information about certain members of the White Rose that are not commonly available in the English language. And the biggest example of this was when I reached out to Josephine's son to get permission to use her words in this project. He offered to introduce me to Igor Khramo, who had written a biography of Alexander Schmorell, which is available in Russian and in German. In fact, I think I remember seeing a copy of the book in Josephine's file at the Hoover Archives, but I couldn't read it. So Charles Pasternak put me in touch with Igor, who sent me an English version of his book that hadn't been published. So it was really fascinating to read his research, many of the letters and anecdotes from the living family members of Alexander Schmorell. It gave me certain insights that I hadn't come across elsewhere before in my research. He was drafted as a soldier, but he sort of had a nervous breakdown at the thought of having to fight against Russians. So he became a medic, which was a way for him to avoid having to be a combat soldier. I just thought it was one of the things that reminded me of studying Dr. Zhivago, of all these medical students who are also very sort of poetically, artistically inclined, and also in contrast to the fact that it was so much of the medical establishment that enabled the atrocities of Nazi Germany and were, not really abiding to a moral code that maybe existed before.
No, first of all, of course, his father encouraged him to pursue the medical career, or even pressed him to do this, rather than sculpture, in the belief that, it is a safer career than anything else. His own life story was a kind of confirmation, a proof to this. Mm-hmm. But then Shurik really realized an additional benefit from this because of the possibility of avoiding the combat situation. Returning to his Gvatsk period, it was there within perhaps the church when he encountered the parishioners who of course felt happy because of the possibility now to be at the church services, to attend church services, to pray, and not to fear the praying. From conversation with them, he also learned about the agonizing facts of the so-called collectivization, of the destruction of peasantry in Russia, and such hatred for the Bolshevik regime, of course, was instilled in him, not just by his family's recollections about the Civil War, but from these conversations of in Russia, in his homeland,
Mm.
in his spiritual homeland.
Now back to Josephine and her essay.
Now, of course, it is funny how she recalls how she learned about this from the BBC German service broadcast that was directed as the audience in German-speaking countries during the war. There's this connection of two different names. She knew, but she couldn't connect them.
Right.
Because they were not connected in real life until a certain period at the end of 1942, when they sought an introduction to Huber. And what is remarkable here that it happened after this trip to Russia of these medical students, including Shurik, because they came back with a different eyes, with a different kind of determination in this apocalyptic atmosphere of the imminent collapse of their country. It was already in the air, these premonitions of the imminent collapse of the German state.
And it seems like Kurt Huber would not have contributed to the White Rose if not for hearing about his students' experience at the front.
He probably was not thinking about this at all. Yes, but as soon as he learned that there is a group of youth, who started already, there is an additional one, also somewhat breathtaking coincidence, that one of the members of this group, Falk
Harnack?
Yeah, Harnack, was also somewhat indirectly connected with the Pasternak family.
Oh, wow. Falk Harnack was obviously not one of the 6 individuals who were executed as part of the White Rose activities, but he was sort of in the circles as an ancillary figure and apparently did contribute to the text of the 5th leaflet.
In any case, even if there is no personal acquaintance, these 2 families had to know of their existence because his uncle, a very prominent theologian, very prominent. This was the family of Baltic German origin, speaking Russian. Natively.
I think Josephine mentioned the uncle in her memoir.
But of course.
Yeah.
Yes, of course. Leonid Pasternak painted his portrait. That's one of his most famous, yes. And I know, and he was instrumental in Harnack. Was instrumental in securing an academic career of Boris's cousin, Olga Freidenberg, who was a great classical scholar, and Harnack's letter to her was a kind of her introduction into the highest levels of her professional field.
Wow.
And this letter was obtained through Leonid Pasternak in Berlin.
Wow.
Yes, but this Falk Harnack was the younger brother of the member of the Red Capella organization. This is much better known.
It was a communist resistance.
Communist resistance, moreover, this was a spy network of the Soviets, even before the war. And his elder brother was a known fact. He was enlisted as an agent, as a secret agent of Soviet secret services.
Wow.
Before he was a great sympathizer of Marxism and Soviet regime.
This was Falk himself or his brother?
His brother.
His brother. Because
already executed by the time of his joining by the White Rose.
I think Falk contributed, he helped write the 5th leaflet, I believe. And Kurt Huber didn't want to have anything to do with anything communist. So there were a lot of disagreements, apparently, over sort of what ideological direction they were going. So I think that's very interesting. I didn't know that the Red Capella was a spy network of the Soviet Union. That's so interesting.
I recently read memoirs of one of the highest place NKVD official.
The NKVD was the precursor to the KGB, basically the Soviet secret police.
In which he mentions this Red Capella and the being recruited by his organization in the 30s. You know, also very, very tragic fates of the participants, of those who survived after the war, were tortured by the Soviet secret police and condemned to long prison terms.
Such a complicated, fascinating time.
Yeah, 20th century history.
I just found it so interesting. I mean, it's not connected to the White Rose, but what it meant to be a more public person during that time, you know, and learning about Pasternak and how basically had to censor himself and how the fame and attention became a problem for his artistic life. There are maybe some parallels to Kurt Huber in that regard. It seems like his academic legacy was largely erased and he sort of lost opportunities because he wouldn't use his work for Nazi propaganda.
As far as I remember, he is the author of 2 books.
But he was an expert in musical folklore, and all of his
musical theory, yes.
Many of his articles went out of print and were never published again, and it was he basically couldn't get any rank beyond sort of an adjunct professor after he wouldn't comply.
Josephine speaks about him very, very compelling way, that he is completely absorbed by his own ideas, by his dedication to his profession. And when she is saying this, I imagine that she would use precisely the same expressions to describe her brother in everyday life, being somewhat remote from everyday concerns, being completely immersed into the world of his ideas and so on. And of course, it was not something that any totalitarian regime would embrace, accept, encourage. The same was in the Soviet Union. When such persons, such scholars appeared, you know, they were not allowed to proceed until they swore loyalty.
It's endlessly fascinating. I feel like I still know so little about all of it. But
so do I. But always when we embark on any path, you know, in the beginning we are completely disoriented and despaired.
Yeah.
Yeah, by the abundance of unknown.
Yeah.
But then slowly we find a kind of thread.